You may recognize a moment when effort begins to feel strangely ineffective. You are still doing the same things, applying the same discipline, using the same strategies that once produced results. But the response has changed. Movement slows. Resistance increases. Outcomes shrink while effort expands. This is usually the point where most people push harder. They increase pressure. They add urgency. They tighten control. And yet, something in you may already sense that this instinct is outdated. Not wrong. Outdated. Carl Jung observed that the psyche does not respond indefinitely to force. Force works only as long as psychic energy is aligned with the direction of effort. When alignment fades, force becomes wasteful. It disperses energy instead of mobilizing it. This is why pushing eventually stops working. Not because you are weak. Not because circumstances are against you. Because the inner configuration that once supported effort has changed. You can feel this change before you understand it. Effort begins to feel heavy rather than engaging. Repetition replaces progress. Persistence turns into strain. Strain is a signal. Strain indicates that energy is being applied against the grain of the psyche. Earlier in your life, pushing may have felt natural. You identified with effort. You measured yourself through output, resilience, and persistence. Pushing gave you structure. It organized your days. It provided direction. But pushing is not a universal mode of operation. It is a phase-specific one. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological development moves through alternating phases of expansion and withdrawal. Expansion requires effort. Withdrawal requires restraint. Problems arise when effort continues past its functional phase. You may be living in that transition. You notice that effort no longer brings clarity. Action no longer settles doubt. Trying harder no longer restores momentum. This creates a subtle but persistent tension. You are active but not effective. Engaged but not aligned. The mind usually mislabels this as failure. But failure implies that the same strategy should still work. Here, the strategy itself has expired. Pushing depends on external resistance. It needs obstacles to overcome. It feeds on friction. When friction no longer teaches anything new, pushing becomes circular. You repeat yourself psychologically. Carl Jung described this as a moment when consciousness has extracted all available meaning from a particular attitude. Continuing to act from that attitude produces diminishing returns. The psyche responds by reducing cooperation, not dramatically, quietly. You may notice reduced enthusiasm, increased fatigue, a vague sense of resistance that cannot be explained rationally. This resistance is not laziness. It is misalignment. The psyche is no longer invested in the direction effort is taking. This is why pushing begins to feel like self-opposition. You push, but something you pulls back. That internal split creates exhaustion. In daily life, this often appears in work, relationships, or personal goals. You keep explaining yourself, but the dynamic does not change. You keep initiating, but the response weakens. You keep adjusting, but nothing stabilizes. The instinctive response is to try harder. But trying harder assumes that effort is still the solution. Carl Jung would say that at this stage, effort is a problem. Effort is now interfering with necessary rebalancing of energy. Energy wants to return inward. Effort forces it outward. This conflict produces strain. You may notice that you are doing more, while feeling less present. Activity increases, but satisfaction drops. You are involved, but not nourished by involvement. This is a crucial signal. When pushing is aligned, it energizes. When pushing is misaligned, it depletes. Depletion is not a character flaw. It is information. It tells you that the psyche is no longer organized around outward force. This is often the point where people feel confused. They ask themselves why they cannot access the same drive they once had. They worry that they have lost ambition or discipline. They assume something is wrong with their motivation. But motivation has not disappeared. Its function has changed. Carl Jung distinguished between directed energy and free energy. Directed energy fuels action toward a goal. Free energy supports reorganization. When free energy is required, directed effort must reduce. Otherwise, the psyche cannot recalibrate. This is why pushing becomes counterproductive. The system needs space, not pressure. Pressure collapses nuance. Space allows reconfiguration. You may notice that when you stop forcing solutions, subtle shifts occur. Not immediately, not dramatically, but internally, tension eases. This is not relief from giving up. It is relief from misapplied effort. The psyche responds positively to accuracy. Accuracy here means matching behavior to internal state. If your internal state has shifted toward withdrawal, forcing expansion creates conflict. Carl Jung believed that when conflict persists, the psyche eventually enforces correction through symptoms: fatigue, loss of interest, irritability, or a sense of futility. These are not punishments. They are regulators. They signal that pushing has exceeded its functional window. You may also notice that the more you push, the less others respond. Conversations feel strained. Interactions feel forced. Dynamics harden instead of softening. This is not coincidence. Psychic energy is relational. When you push outward energetically, others feel pressure even if you say nothing. Pressure invites resistance. Resistance escalates the cycle. This is why pushing often worsens dynamics rather than improving them. Carl Jung observed that unconscious pressure creates counterpressure. The psyche, both yours and others, seeks equilibrium. When you stop pushing, equilibrium has a chance to restore itself. But this runs against learned behavior. Most people are trained to equate effort with value. They believe that stopping effort means quitting, failing, or regressing. This belief keeps them locked in misaligned action. You may already feel that this belief no longer fits. You are not looking for shortcuts. You are not avoiding responsibility. You are sensing that the method itself has expired. This sensing is not intellectual. It is bodily, emotional, energetic. You feel it as tension that does not resolve through action. Carl Jung trusted these signals. He believed the psyche communicates through effect long before the mind understands a message. The message here is simple, though not easy to accept. Pushing has done its work. Continuing it will not produce new outcomes. Something else is required. Not withdrawal from life. Not passivity. Recalibration. Recalibration begins when energy is allowed to return inward. This inward movement is often experienced as pulling back. Pulling back feels dangerous only if you believe effort is the only stabilizer of reality. But reality is not stabilized by effort alone. It is stabilized by balance. Balance requires periods of non-force. You may notice that when you pull back even slightly, anxiety arises. Questions appear. Doubts surface. What if nothing happens? What if I lose momentum? What if this means I'm giving up? These questions are not warnings. They are residues of an old orientation. Carl Jung would say they belong to the ego's fear of losing control. Control once ensured survival. But control is not required at every phase of development. When control persists beyond its necessity, it creates rigidity. Rigidity breaks under pressure. The psyche avoids this by withdrawing cooperation. This withdrawal is what you are feeling now. It is not a shutdown. It is a redirection. You are being asked to stop forcing outcomes so that underlying dynamics can reset. This reset cannot occur under constant effort. Effort maintains the existing configuration. Pulling back allows a new configuration to form. This is why pushing eventually stops working. Not because life is resisting you, but because life is no longer organized around the same rules. You are encountering a psychological threshold. On one side, effort produces results. On the other, effort produces strain. The threshold is crossed quietly. Most people do not notice it. They only notice exhaustion. You have noticed something earlier. You noticed the mismatch. That noticing is significant. It means you are no longer fully identified with effort as identity. You can observe pushing instead of being it. This observation creates choice. Not the choice to quit. The choice to stop misapplying energy. Carl Jung emphasized that growth often begins with subtraction rather than addition. Removing force restores sensitivity. Sensitivity reveals what effort obscured. Sensitivity does not mean vulnerability. It means accuracy. Accuracy is what pushing has lost. Pulling back restores it. But pulling back is not yet action. It is recognition. Recognition that the phase of force has completed. recognition that continuing it would create distortion, recognition that something else is now required. That something else does not announce itself immediately. It begins as restraint. Restraint feels like loss only when effort defined your worth. If effort defined your worth, stopping feels like disappearance. But worth does not disappear. It recalibrates. The psyche is preparing to reorganize how energy moves through you. That reorganization cannot happen under pressure. So pushing stops working, not as punishment, not as failure, as signal. And the signal is clear. Force has finished teaching what it can. What comes next will not respond to more of it. That understanding alone changes how effort feels. You stop blaming yourself for resistance. You stop escalating pressure. You stop demanding movement from a system that is asking for balance. This does not resolve everything, but it settles something fundamental. You realize that pushing is no longer the lever. And once you see that clearly, you also sense that pulling back is not retreat. It is the beginning of a different dynamic, one that does not require force to function. That dynamic has not yet fully revealed itself. But the moment you stop pushing, the system finally has space to reset. And that reset is what makes everything else possible. You may notice that the moment you stop pushing, something subtle begins to shift. Not outwardly, not immediately, but internally, the constant friction eases. The tension that lived beneath your actions loosens its grip. You are still present, still aware, still engaged with life. But you are no longer bracing yourself against it. This is not collapse. It is redistribution. Carl Jung understood pulling back not as retreat, but as a return of psychic energy to its center. When energy stops being forced outward, it does not vanish. It reorganizes. That reorganization is what changes everything. Earlier, your energy was directed. It had a target, a goal, an outcome it was meant to produce. Directed energy is effective when alignment exists. But once alignment fades, directed energy turns corrosive. Pulling back interrupts that corrosion. You may feel this interruption as relief mixed with uncertainty. Relief because the internal struggle decreases. Uncertainty because the familiar structure of effort dissolves. Structure once came from action. Now it must come from balance. This transition often feels uncomfortable because it removes a familiar sense of agency. You were used to influencing situations through effort. Pulling back feels like surrendering leverage. But leverage is only useful when the system responds to it. Carl Jung emphasized that when the psyche withdraws energy from a pattern, continuing to apply that pattern produces resistance rather than results. Pulling back allows the psyche to redistribute energy where it is actually needed. You may notice that your attention changes first. Earlier, your attention was outwardly focused. You monitored responses. You evaluated progress. You watched for signs that your effort was working. Now, attention settles inward without deliberate intention. You are not introspective in a dramatic way. You are simply less reactive. This reduction in reactivity is not passivity. It is containment. Containment allows energy to concentrate instead of dispersing. Dispersed energy fuels anxiety. Concentrated energy restores coherence. This coherence begins to alter how situations respond to you, not because you are manipulating them differently, because you are no longer overinvesting. Overinvestment created imbalance. Balance invites adjustment. In relational dynamics, the shift is often striking. When you stop explaining yourself, the other person's position becomes clearer. When you stop chasing response either arrives naturally or reveals its absence. When you stop managing the dynamic reveals its true structure. Carl Jung believed that unconscious dynamics require pressure to stay hidden. When pressure is removed, truth surfaces without confrontation. Pulling back removes pressure. This is why dynamics often reset when you stop pushing. Not because others change immediately, but because a false equilibrium collapses. Earlier, effort maintained an artificial balance. You compensated. You adapted. You filled gaps. You absorbed tension. That compensation kept things running. But it also prevented resolution. When you pull back, compensation ends. What cannot stand on its own begins to show strain. What is viable stabilizes. What is misaligned loosens. This can feel unsettling. You may worry that pulling back will cause things to fall apart. Sometimes it does, but falling apart reveals what was already unsustainable. Carl Jung did not view breakdown as failure. He saw it as exposure or truth. Structures that require constant force to exist are already unstable. Pulling back allows instability to surface. This is not destruction. It is clarification. You may notice that situations begin to reorganize without your intervention. Conversations shift tone. Responsibilities redistribute. Expectations recalibrate. Not because you demanded change, because your energy stopped propping things up. This redistribution happens quietly. At first, nothing seems different. Then, small adjustments appear. Over time, the entire dynamic changes. Carl Jung described this as psychic equilibrium restoring itself once artificial pressure is removed. The psyche, both individual and collective, seeks balance naturally. Effort interferes with that process. When it becomes excessive, pulling back restores the system's ability to self-regulate. You may also notice changes in your internal dialogue. Earlier, your mind was busy evaluating outcomes. Now it becomes quieter, not silent, but less directive. Thoughts arise, but they do not demand action. This mental quiet is often misread as lack of engagement. In reality, it is cognitive rebalancing. Your psyche is no longer allocating resources to constant decision-making. Decision-making consumed energy. Now that consumption decreases. That energy becomes available for perception. You begin to see things more clearly, not because you analyze more, but because you interfere less. Interference distorted perception. Restraint sharpens it. This sharpening does not feel dramatic. It feels like neutrality with clarity. Carl Jung believed that insight often emerges when the ego stops trying to control the process. Control narrows perception. Withdrawal widens it. Widened perception changes how you interpret events. You stop taking resistance personally. You stop interpreting delay as rejection. You stop framing outcomes as reflections of your worth. These interpretations belong to a phase where effort equaled identity. When effort withdraws, identity decouples from outcome. This decoupling is essential. It allows you to observe dynamics without merging with them. Observation replaces involvement. Involvement once fueled effort. Observation fuels understanding. Understanding does not require pushing. It requires space. You may notice that emotions change quality. Earlier, frustration, urgency, or disappointment carried momentum. They push you to act, explain, or fix. Now, emotions arise without propulsion. You feel them, but they do not move you automatically. This does not mean emotions are weaker. It means they are no longer directive. Carl Jung understood emotions as carriers of energy. When energy is no longer directed outward, emotions lose their compulsive force. They inform rather than command. This change can feel disorienting. You may wonder why you are no longer driven by feelings that once motivated you. The answer is not loss. It is integration. Integrated emotion does not push behavior. It colors awareness. Awareness guides movement more accurately than impulse. This is another reason pulling back resets dynamics. You are no longer reacting. You are responding when response fits. Response is selective. Reaction is automatic. Selective response changes everything. In work situations, this often leads to fewer but more decisive actions. You stop over-communicating. You stop anticipating every outcome. You stop managing impressions. As a result, your actions carry more weight. Weight comes from restraint. Carl Jung emphasized that psychic energy conserved through restraint becomes potent. It concentrates rather than dissipates. This potency is felt by others even when nothing is said. Your presence changes, not because you assert authority, because you are no longer leaking energy through effort. This presence can feel grounding to some and unsettling to others. Those who relied on your effort may feel destabilized. Those who resonate with balance may feel drawn. This sorting is natural. Pulling back reveals compatibility. It does not create distance arbitrarily. It clarifies relational truth. You may also notice that pulling back exposes your own patterns. Without constant action, underlying anxieties surface briefly. Questions appear. Uncertainty becomes visible. This is not regression. It is exposure. Exposure allows recalibration. Carl Jung believed that when unconscious material surfaces, it does so because the psyche has sufficient stability to handle it. Pulling back provides that stability. Effort masks discomfort. Restraint reveals it. But revealed discomfort does not overwhelm you now. You can hold it without rushing to resolve it. This holding is new. It signals increased inner capacity. Capacity grows when energy is not wasted on misaligned action. This growth is invisible but decisive. Over time, you may notice that situations require less effort to manage. Things either align or fall away. You no longer feel responsible for maintaining equilibrium everywhere. This release of responsibility is not negligence. It is accuracy. Carl Jung emphasized that taking responsibility for what is not yours depletes psychic energy. Pulling back returns responsibility to where it belongs. This return restores balance. Balance allows movement to resume later without strain. But that movement is not the focus yet. The focus now is recalibration. Recalibration does not produce immediate results. It produces internal order. Internal order precedes external change. You may be tempted to re-engage effort once you feel calmer. This temptation is natural, but the key shift is that effort is no longer compulsive. You can choose it rather than default to it. Choice replaces reflex. This replacement is the real transformation. Carl Jung believed that freedom begins when compulsion ends. Pulling back ends compulsion without requiring withdrawal from life. You remain involved but not entangled, present but not pressured, engaged but not drained. This state is often mistaken for indifference. It is not. It is balanced engagement. Balanced engagement changes how life responds to you, not because life rewards restraint, because restraint allows truth to surface. Truth does not require force. It requires space. Pulling back creates that space. In that space, dynamics recalibrate themselves. Some will strengthen. Some will dissolve. Some will transform quietly. You do not control this process. You witness it. Witnessing is enough. Carl Jung trusted this process deeply. He saw that when the psyche is allowed to self-regulate, it moves toward balance naturally. Your role is not to push it there. Your role is to stop interfering. That is what pulling back does. It does not abandon life. It removes distortion. And once distortion is gone, the system begins to organize itself in ways effort never could. This is why pulling back changes everything. Not because you retreat, because you finally allow balance to do the work force was trying to accomplish. And balance, unlike force, does not exhaust what it moves. It stabilizes it. You begin to notice that movement returns without announcement, not as urgency, not as pressure, not as a familiar surge that once demanded immediate action. It returns as steadiness. The internal tension that once accompanied every decision is gone. You still choose. You still act. But the actions no longer feel like attempts to restore control or momentum. They feel proportional. Carl Jung understood this stage as a psyche completing its corrective loop. When energy has been pulled back long enough to rebalance, it naturally begins to flow outward again. Not explosively, not dramatically, precisely. Precision replaces force. Earlier, force was necessary because clarity was incomplete. Now, clarity does not need to be asserted. It is implied by fit. You sense where energy belongs without having to justify it to yourself. This is the most noticeable change. You no longer argue internally before acting. The debates that once preceded movement have quieted. You do not need to convince yourself that something is worth doing. If it fits, you move. If it does not, you do not. This simplicity was not available before. It required the full withdrawal of misapplied effort. Carl Jung believed that when the psyche restores equilibrium, decision-making shifts from the ego to the self. The ego deliberates. The self recognizes. Recognition is faster and calmer than deliberation. This is why movement now feels obvious rather than exciting. Excitement belongs to anticipation. Obviousness belongs to alignment. You may notice that you act more slowly, but with greater consistency. You no longer surge forward and collapse. You move at a pace that does not require recovery. Recovery once followed effort. Now, effort has changed shape. Effort no longer drains. It circulates. This circulation is subtle, but unmistakable. You engage with work, relationships, or responsibilities, and notice that energy returns rather than depletes. You do something, and instead of feeling spent, you feel settled. This settling is new. Earlier, action created tension because it was compensating for imbalance. Now, action expresses balance rather than correcting its absence. Carl Jung emphasized that when psychic energy is aligned, action strengthens the psyche instead of fragmenting it. Fragmentation required rest to repair. Alignment sustains itself. This is how movement stabilizes. Another shift occurs in how you relate to outcomes. Earlier, outcomes carried emotional weight. Success reassured you. Failure destabilized you. Results mattered because they validated effort. Now, outcomes inform rather than define. You care about results, but they do not anchor your sense of self. You adjust based on feedback, without internal drama. This is not detachment. It is proportional involvement. Carl Jung described this as the ego no longer inflating around success or deflating around failure. When inflation and deflation stop, movement becomes resilient. Resilience here does not mean endurance. It means flexibility. You adapt without resistance. You redirect without self-judgment. You pause without anxiety. These responses were not possible earlier because effort was carrying identity. Now, identity is no longer negotiated through action. Action is simply action. This distinction changes how momentum feels. Momentum is no longer something you chase. It emerges naturally from consistency. Consistency replaces intensity. Intensity was unsustainable because it relied on force. Consistency is sustainable because it relies on fit. You may notice that others respond differently to you. Without effortful engagement, your presence feels grounded. You are less reactive, less explanatory, less invested in managing perceptions. This changes dynamics quietly. Some people lean in. Some drift away. Some interactions simplify. This is not loss. It is sorting. Carl Jung believed that when the psyche is aligned, relationships reorganize around truth rather than habit. Habitual dynamics dissolve when effort is withdrawn. Authentic dynamics remain. This reorganization does not require confrontation. It happens through absence of compensation. You're no longer filling gaps. No longer smoothing tension. No longer carrying more than your share. As a result, what belongs to others returns to them. This redistribution restores balance. Balance alters movement. You no longer feel responsible for everything moving forward. You contribute where contribution fits and step back where it does not. Stepping back no longer feels like avoidance. It feels accurate. Accuracy is the defining feature of this phase. You respond to what is present, not to what you imagine should be present. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological maturity is marked by responsiveness to reality rather than adherence to ideals. Ideals once guided your effort. Now, reality guides your movement. Reality is quieter than ideals. It does not inspire. It informs. Information replaces motivation. You act because something is required, not because something is promised. This reduces internal pressure. Pressure once created urgency. Urgency distorted timing. Now, timing becomes clearer. You sense when something is ready. You sense when it is not. You no longer push timing. Timing emerges from balance. This is why pulling back ultimately restores movement. Movement that respects timing does not encounter resistance. Resistance once signaled misalignment. Now, resistance becomes rare. When it appears, you do not fight it. You pause. Pausing does not threaten momentum anymore. Earlier, pausing felt dangerous because momentum was fragile. Now, momentum is stable. Stability allows pause. Carl Jung believed that the psyche oscillates naturally between activity and rest when equilibrium is restored. Forcing either disrupts the rhythm. You are now inside that rhythm. You move. You pause. You adjust. None of these require justification. They feel normal. This normality is important. Earlier, change felt dramatic because effort amplified everything. Now, change feels integrated. Integration removes spectacle. Life does not feel extraordinary. It feels workable. Workable does not mean dull. It means sustainable. Sustainability is the outcome of recalibration. You may also notice that your relationship to desire has changed. Earlier, desire pulled you forward. It created tension between where you were and where you wanted to be. Now, desire is quieter. It informs rather than drives. You want things, but wanting does not destabilize you. You pursue without urgency. You release without bitterness. Carl Jung understood desire as energy-seeking form. When form stabilizes internally, desire no longer needs to push outward aggressively. This softening of desire is not loss of vitality. It is refinement. Vitality no longer leaks through craving. It concentrates through engagement. This concentration supports sustained movement. You may also notice that fear behaves differently. Earlier, fear either motivated or paralyzed you. Now, fear registers without dictating behavior. You feel caution without panic, awareness without avoidance. This balanced fear allows intelligent movement. Carl Jung believed that fear loses its compulsive power once the psyche trusts its internal authority. Fear becomes information rather than command. Information guides. Command control. Control belongs to the pushing phase. Guidance belongs to the recalibrated phase. This shift in authority is subtle but decisive. You no longer feel the need to monitor yourself constantly. You trust your responses. You trust your pauses. You trust your timing. Trust does not feel dramatic. It feels like absence of doubt. This absence frees attention. You are more present, not because you try to be, but because nothing inside you is pulling attention elsewhere. Attention stabilizes in the present when effort stops fragmenting it. Fragmentation once came from pushing in multiple directions. Now, direction is singular, even if it is not fully defined. You're oriented without being fixated. Orientation allows movement without fixation. This is why you can move forward without knowing exactly where you are going. The path reveals itself through engagement. Carl Jung believed that the psyche reveals direction only to those who are capable of walking without guarantees. Pulling back developed that capacity. You learn to tolerate absence of control. You learn to hold uncertainty. You learn to stop forcing meaning. These capacities now support movement. Movement no longer threatens you with collapse. It feels natural. You may also notice that you no longer talk as much about what you are doing or planning. Not because you are secretive, but because narration feels unnecessary. You live your movement rather than explaining it. Explanation belongs to effort. Living belongs to alignment. This reduces noise. Life feels quieter, but more solid. Quieter because less energy is wasted. More solid because what remains is structurally sound. This solidity does not depend on circumstances. It remains even when situations change. Carl Jung emphasized that when the psyche reorganizes successfully, it becomes less dependent on external stability. Inner balance provides continuity. This continuity allows you to navigate change without losing yourself. You adapt without fragmentation. You adjust without resentment. You respond without self-criticism. These responses mark the completion of recalibration. You are no longer correcting imbalance. You are operating from balance. Balance does not need to be defended. It expresses itself through proportion. Your actions are proportional. Your engagement is proportional. Your withdrawal is proportional. Nothing is excessive. Excess belongs to the pushing phase. Now, excess feels unnecessary. This does not make life smaller. It makes it accurate. Accuracy allows movement that lasts. You are no longer trying to make things happen. Things happen through you, not because you are passive, because you are aligned. Carl Jung believed that alignment is the quiet endpoint of psychological development. It does not eliminate struggle, but it removes inner opposition. Without inner opposition, movement no longer feels like effort. It feels like participation. You participate in life without forcing it. You engage without gripping. You move without pushing. This is a dynamic that emerges after pulling back, not stagnation. not retreat. Rebalance motion. Motion that does not announce itself. Motion that does not require validation. Motion that does not exhaust what moves. This is why pulling back changes everything. It does not stop life. It restores the conditions under which life can move without breaking you. And once those conditions are restored, movement no longer needs to be pursued. It simply resumes, quietly, naturally, and on terms that no longer require force to sustain. Nothing ended when you pulled back. What ended was the need to carry life through effort alone. The resistance you encountered was not opposition from the world. It was a signal from within that the method you were using had reached its limit. Carl Jung understood that psychic energy cannot be forced indefinitely without distortion. When force outlives its usefulness, the psyche corrects by withdrawing cooperation. That withdrawal was not failure. It was calibration. By pulling back, you did not abandon responsibility. You returned responsibility to its proper place. You stopped compensating for imbalance. You stopped maintaining dynamics that could not sustain themselves. What followed was not emptiness. It was redistribution. Energy returned to its center. Perception sharpened. Action lost its compulsive edge. Movement reappeared, not as urgency, but as steadiness. This is what balance feels like. Not dramatic, not triumphant, not loud, simply workable. You now move without needing to justify movement. You pause without fearing collapse. You engage without exhausting yourself. Nothing external had to change for this to happen. The change occurred in how force was replaced by fit. That replacement does not guarantee ease. It guarantees coherence. Coherence allows life to move without constant correction. This is why pulling back changed everything. Not because you stopped caring, because you stopped forcing. And once force was no longer required, life did not need to resist you anymore. It could meet you where you actually were. That is not retreat. It is alignment. And alignment does not ask for effort to prove itself. It simply holds.